The groan of tortured metal was the first thing to slice through the static in Rusty Vance's head. It was a sound he knew intimately, the symphony of his life, the sound of the Betsy dying. He forced his eyes open, the ship's emergency lights painting the cockpit in a hellish pulsing crimson. Outside the viewport, a nightmare of emerald and shadow swirled, a jungle so dense it seemed to swallow the very light. "Status bets," he rasped, his throat raw. A cascade of sparks erupted from a console to his right, a final defiant firework before it went dark. "Status?" The ship's AI crackled through the comms, her synthesized voice dripping with more sarcasm than a barrel of reactor coolant. "Oh, let's see. We've just performed an unscheduled high-velocity lithobraking maneuver on an uncharted rock designated Krillis Prime. The primary fusion core is spitting ions like a cornered sandcat, and the port stabilizer looks like it tried to French kiss a mountain. Other than that, we're peachy. How's your leg?" Rusty looked down. A jagged piece of bulkhead plating was pinning his left thigh to the command chair. Blood, dark and thick, was soaking through his tactical pants. He grunted, gripping the twisted metal with both hands. His biceps and forearms, corded with the muscle of a man who wrestled with cargo containers for a living, strained until the veins stood out like river maps on his skin. With a final guttural roar that was more animal than human, he tore the shard free and tossed it clattering to the floor. The pain was a white-hot nova, but it was a familiar pain. It told him he was alive. "Legs fine," he lied, leaning back and breathing heavily. "Just a scratch. We need a new cryoconverter and at least 3 plasma conduits to even think about getting off this rock." "Fantastic," Betsy retorted. "I'll just pop out to the local galactic superstore. Perhaps they have a sale on existential dread while I'm there. The atmosphere is breathable if you enjoy a cocktail of nitrogen, oxygen, and a dozen things that will probably make you grow a second head. Good luck out there, Captain. Try not to get eaten." The comm clicked off. Solitude settled back in, heavy as a lead blanket. He checked his sidearm, a heavy caliber revolver modified for hypervelocity rounds. A relic, like him. Strapping a medkit to his uninjured leg and grabbing his survival pack, he limped to the airlock. The ramp hissed open, descending into a world humming with an alien predatory energy. The air was thick, wet, and overwhelmingly alive. It smelled of damp earth, sweet, rotting blossoms, and something else, something musky and reptilian. Towering bioluminescent trees formed a canopy so complete that the sky was just a distant myth. Every leaf, every vine, every patch of moss pulsed with a soft, ethereal glow, turning the jungle floor into a labyrinth of emerald and turquoise light. It was beautiful in the way a venomous serpent is beautiful. His mission was simple: find a downed ship, a forgotten outpost, anything with salvageable parts. His boots squelched in the mud as he pushed deeper into the jungle, the low mournful notes of a classic Terran blues track from his audio implant, trying to beat back the oppressive silence. But here, the music felt thin, an intruder. The jungle had its own rhythm, a chittering, clicking, slithering symphony that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. Hours bled into one another. The ache in his leg had become a relentless, throbbing drumbeat. He was a creature of open plains and asteroid fields, of the void's predictable physics. This place, with its tangled roots that tripped him, and its unseen things that rustled just beyond the reach of his light, was a cage. He was trespassing. He could feel eyes on him, a primal, unnerving sensation that his years in the lawless outer rim had taught him to trust above all else. He stopped, scanning the glowing foliage. Nothing. He took another step, and the ground beneath him simply vanished. He fell into a pit, landing hard in a tangle of nets woven from some kind of metallic fibrous vine. They were impossibly strong, tightening with every move he made. He cursed, fumbling for his knife, but the more he struggled, the more the net constricted, biting into his flesh. He was a beast in a snare, caught by a trapper far more skilled than him. That's when he saw her. She emerged from the shadows of the jungle canopy, moving with a fluid grace that was both terrifying and hypnotic. She was tall, impossibly so, with a warrior's physique that was all lean muscle and coiled power. Her skin was the color of jade, patterned with intricate swirling black markings that looked like tribal tattoos. Long pointed ears, like a predator's, twitched, catching every sound. She wore a harness of dark leather and bone, barely covering a form that was undeniably, powerfully female. In one hand, she held a long, energy-tipped spear that hummed with latent power. Her eyes, the color of molten gold, fixed on him. There was no malice in them, no anger. There was only the calm, appraising look of a master huntress examining her catch. She circled the pit slowly, her gaze missing nothing. The weapon at his hip, the desperation in his eyes, the blood on his leg. He stopped struggling, recognizing the futility. This was her domain. He was the alien, the prey. He met her gaze, his own jaw set in defiance. He may be trapped, but he would not be cowed. She let out a series of sharp melodic clicks and whistles, a language as alien as the glowing trees. She pointed the spear at him, its tip crackling with energy. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement. You are mine. Without a word, she lowered a rope. The meaning was clear. Climb, or she would come down for him. With his pride stinging more than his wounded leg, Rusty holstered his sidearm and began the slow, agonizing climb out of the pit. When he reached the top, gasping for breath, she was waiting. She was even more imposing up close. He was a big man, used to towering over others, but she met him almost eye to eye. The scent of her was like the jungle itself. Ozone, exotic blossoms, and warm female musk. He straightened up, trying to project an aura of control he didn't feel. The name's Rusty Vance, he said, his voice a low gravel. I mean you no harm. My ship crashed. She tilted her head, her golden eyes narrowing. It was clear she didn't understand a word, but she understood intent. She understood the language of predators. Her hand shot out, not with the spear, but with lightning speed, snatching his revolver from its holster before he could even react. She examined it with detached curiosity, then tucked it into her own belt. She had disarmed him. She had trapped him. She had claimed him. With another series of clicks and a sharp gesture of her spear, she motioned for him to walk. He was no longer a free man, a solitary wanderer of the stars. He was a captive, a prize taken from the emerald heart of a savage world by a huntress who had just completely and utterly dominated him. And as he limped ahead of her, deeper into the glowing, alien jungle, he knew his journey had just taken a turn into a territory far more dangerous than any asteroid field he had ever crossed. The march was a silent humiliation. Every agonizing step Rusty took was a testament to his own powerlessness. The jungle, which had been an impartial cage, now felt like an accomplice to his captor. Kirashe moved ahead of him with an economy of motion that was both mesmerizing and infuriating. She didn't fight the wilderness. She was a part of its current, flowing through the tangled undergrowth as if the razor-edged leaves and thorny vines parted for her willingly. He, on the other hand, felt like a freighter navigating an asteroid field with no thrusters, clumsy and broken. The throbbing in his leg was a constant, vicious reminder of the snare, of his failure. After what felt like an eternity, the oppressive canopy began to thin, not opening to a sky, but to a vast cavernous space between several colossal trees. Suspended between these giants, connected by bridges of woven vines and carved wood, was a village. It was a city in the trees, glowing with the same soft internal luminescence as the forest itself. Pod-like dwellings clung to the massive trunks, their windows like warm, amber eyes watching his approach. The air here was filled with the scent of wood smoke, roasted meat, and the murmur of alien voices. As Kirashe led him into the heart of the settlement, a hush fell. Faces peered from doorways and walkways, members of her tribe. They were of the same species, with jade skin and pointed ears, though none possessed her commanding stature or the intricate markings that designated her as their leader. Their golden eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and awe, fixed on him. He was a creature from a fallen star, a monster from a myth. Children hid behind their mother's legs, their gazes lingering on his strange clothes, his pale skin, his exhaustion. Kirashe let out a sharp, authoritative call. Two male warriors, leaner but just as tough, approached. After a brief exchange of clicks and whistles, they gestured for Rusty to follow. He was led to one of the pods, larger than the others, and ushered inside. It wasn't a prison cell. The space was circular, warm, and smelled of herbs and leather. There were furs on the floor and carved tools hanging on the wall, but the doorway was left open, and the two warriors took up positions outside, their spears held at the ready. A cage without bars is still a cage. He slumped onto a pile of soft furs, the strength finally abandoning his body. He was a trophy, a curiosity put on display. The solitude he had cultivated for years had been a shield. Now, stripped of his ship, his weapon, and his freedom, He felt a hollowness that ached more than his leg. He was just a man, bleeding and broken, a long way from home. Later, he couldn't tell if it was hours or minutes, Kirashe entered alone. She carried a wooden bowl that steamed with a pungent, earthy aroma, and a collection of what looked like medical instruments made of polished bone and obsidian. She knelt before him, her movements deliberate and sure. For a moment he tensed, his instincts screaming at him to resist, to not show weakness, but her gaze wasn't threatening. It was clinical, detached. She set the bowl down, and without asking for permission she knew she didn't need, her strong, calloused fingers began to work at the blood-caked fabric of his pants. Her touch was firm, professional, yet it sent an unwelcome jolt through him. He flinched, not from pain, but from the sheer intimacy of the act. She paused, her golden eyes meeting his. For the first time he saw something flicker behind their predatory focus, a flicker of curiosity. She made a low, soothing sound, the kind one might use to calm a spooked animal. Then, with methodical precision, she cut the fabric away, exposing the deep, ragged gash in his thigh. The wound was ugly, inflamed and crusted with drying blood. She dipped a cloth into the steaming bowl and began to clean the injury. The liquid was hot, and it stung like hell, but as she worked, a strange numbness began to spread from the point of contact, chasing away the throbbing fire. He watched her, fascinated against his will. Her brow was furrowed in concentration. The intricate black markings on her face seemed to shift in the pod's soft light. He saw the immense strength in her hands, yet they moved with the tenderness of a healer. She wasn't just a warrior, she was a caretaker. After cleaning the wound, she applied a thick green paste that cooled his skin instantly. Then she bound it tightly with wide, pliable leaves that felt like supple leather. When she was finished, she sat back on her heels, appraising her work. Her law, he was beginning to realize, was not one of cruelty, but of order. He was her property now, and she would not allow her property to be damaged. Days blurred. His leg began to heal with astonishing speed. He was brought food, strange fruits and expertly cooked meat, and water that tasted of minerals and rain. He spent his time watching the life of the village from his open doorway. He saw Kirashe not as his captor, but as their matriarch. He watched her train the young hunters, her voice sharp with commands, but her hands quick to adjust a stance or guide an aim. He saw her settle a dispute between two elders with a wisdom that seemed ancient. He saw her lift a small child who had fallen, her expression softening for a fleeting moment into something that looked like motherhood. She carried the weight of her entire tribe on her shoulders, and she did it with a quiet, unyielding strength that he, a man who ran from his own burdens, could only admire. The promesa quebrada, the broken promise from his past, whispered in the back of his mind, a ghost of a time when he too had been a protector and had failed. One evening, as the twin moons of Krillis Prime bathed the jungle in a silver and violet glow, she came to him herself, carrying his portion of the evening meal. The guards had been dismissed. She set the food down, and instead of leaving, she sat across from him, her long legs crossed, her spear resting against the wall. She watched him eat, her head tilted. He ate slowly, feeling the weight of her gaze. When he was done, he met her eyes across the small fire pit in the center of the room. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with 1,000 unasked questions. He gestured to the intricate markings on her arm. "What do these mean?" he asked, knowing she wouldn't understand the words, only the gesture. She looked down at her arm, then back at him. She touched the swirling patterns on her skin, then pointed to the village outside, and finally touched her own heart. A story of lineage, of duty, of her people. He understood. Then she did something that surprised him. She reached out, her fingers hesitating for a moment before lightly tracing the old faded scar across his brow, a relic from a bar fight in a forgotten mining colony. Her touch was feather-light, inquisitive. In that moment, the space between them shrank. He wasn't just a captive, and she wasn't just a huntress. They were a man and a woman, from different worlds, scarred by different lives, seeing each other for the first time. A reluctant respect had been growing in his heart for days. But now, sitting in the quiet glow of her home, he felt something else taking root, something far more dangerous. It was an attraction to her strength, her authority, her untamed spirit, an attraction to the very woman who held his life in her hands. The rhythm of life in the treetop village began to seep into Rusty's bones. The initial sting of captivity had faded, replaced by a strange, almost peaceful sense of belonging he hadn't felt in decades. He learned the meaning of certain sounds, the sharp cry of a sentry that signaled a predator in the undergrowth, the soft hum that rose from the central dwellings at dusk as the tribe gathered, the melodic cadence of Kirishay's voice when she issued commands. His leg was nearly healed, the alien poultice having worked a magic that Terran medtech couldn't match. He was no longer confined to her dwelling. He was allowed to walk the swaying bridges of the village, always under the watchful eye of a guard, but with a measure of trust that felt earned. He began to understand her people, the Cathar. They were fierce, but not cruel. Their lives were a constant dance with the savage beauty of Krillis Prime. They respected strength above all else, and in the last few weeks, Rusty had started to demonstrate his own. He helped reinforce a collapsing walkway, his raw, muscular power doing the work of 3 Cathar warriors. He used his knowledge of basic engineering to jury-rig a water purification system from salvaged parts of a hunting trap, earning grunts of approval from the elders. He was still the outsider, the strange creature from the void, but he was no longer just a trophy. His interactions with Kirishay had evolved into a silent, complex language. They would often sit together after the evening meal, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the walls of her dwelling. He would tell her stories of distant stars and neon-drenched cities, his voice a low rumble. She would listen, her golden eyes reflecting the flames, and though she didn't understand the words, she seemed to grasp the loneliness woven through them. In return, she would show him the constellations of her sky, tracing their paths with her long, elegant fingers and giving them names that sounded like whispers of the wind. The attraction he felt had deepened into a dangerous current that flowed between them. It was in the way her gaze lingered on him when she thought he wasn't looking, the way he found himself watching the play of muscle in her back as she practiced with her spear. It was a raw, unspoken magnetism, a connection forged in dominance and mutual respect. For the first time since he fled his past, Rusty felt the ice around his heart begin to crack. The night it happened, the larger of the 2 moons, the one that glowed a deep, ominous purple, was full. A strange tension hung in the air, a stillness that felt heavier than silence. The jungle below was unnaturally quiet. The first warning was a blood-curdling shriek that tore through the night, followed instantly by the explosive crack of a primitive kinetic rifle. Rusty was on his feet in a heartbeat, his instincts screaming. Kirishay burst into the dwelling, her face a mask of cold fury. In one hand she held her spear, in the other she held his revolver. She tossed it to him. The weight of the weapon in his hand was a familiar comfort. A piece of his old life returned. "Harak Tul," she spat, the name a guttural curse. It was one of the few words of her language he had learned. It meant carniceros, scavengers, butchers, a rival tribe. The village erupted into chaos. Brutish, hulking figures were swarming up the trunks of the great trees, their forms silhouetted against the violet moonlight. They were a different clan, broader, more savage, their skin a mottled gray. They carried crude firearms and barbed blades, and they fought with a berserker's frenzy. Explosions rocked the suspended platforms, the air filled with the smell of ozone, burning wood, and spilled blood. Cathar warriors met the invaders with spear and claw, their battle cries echoing through the canopy. It was a desperate, brutal fight for survival. Through the smoke and confusion, Rusty saw his chance. The path to the forest floor was chaotic but clear. He could slip away in the mayhem, find his way back to the Betsy, and try to piece her back together. This wasn't his fight. He owed these people nothing. He was a prisoner here, wasn't he? He took a step towards the shadows, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, and then he saw her. Kirishay was a whirlwind of jade and steel, her spear a blur of deadly motion. She fought not like a soldier but like a force of nature, but she wasn't on the front lines. She was standing before the entrance to a large communal pod, the nursery. A group of hulking Jarak-Tul brutes were trying to smash their way in, their cruel laughter echoing over the cries of the terrified young inside. Kirishay stood her ground, a lone lioness defending her cubs against a pack of hyenas. She took down one, then another, but she was outnumbered. A blast from a kinetic rifle grazed her side, and she staggered, a deep gash opening on her ribs. She cried out in pain, but didn't fall. Her spear still held defiantly between her and the invaders. Something inside Rusty shattered. The image of her wounded and surrounded but refusing to yield superimposed itself over a memory he had spent a lifetime trying to bury. A memory of another attack, another time he should have stood and fought, Another promise he had broken. The ghost of his past rose up and screamed at him. Not again. He let out a roar of pure, unadulterated rage. He wasn't running. Not this time. He charged into the fray, his revolver bucking in his hand. The hypervelocity rounds tore through the scavenger's crude armor with devastating effect. He moved like the trained soldier he once was, a whirlwind of calculated violence. He fought back-to-back with Kirishai, their movements sinking into a deadly, unspoken choreography. Her primal ferocity and his tactical precision became a single, unstoppable weapon. She would block a clumsy swing with the haft of her spear, creating an opening for him to fire. He would drop an enemy at her flank, allowing her to focus on the one in front. The air grew thick with the coppery tang of blood. Together, they drove the attackers back from the nursery, a bulwark of defiance against the tide of savagery. The remaining Jarok-Tul, seeing their numbers dwindling and their prize denied, finally broke and fled, melting back into the jungle depths from which they came. Silence descended, broken only by the crackling of fires and the mournful cries of the wounded. The violet moonlight illuminated a scene of carnage. Rusty stood panting, his knuckles white around the grip of his revolver. Kirishai leaned heavily on her spear, her breath coming in ragged gasps, blood dripping from the wound in her side. She turned to him, her golden eyes locking onto his. The warrior was gone. The matriarch was gone. All that remained was the woman, raw, vulnerable, and alive. The space between them crackled with an energy more potent than any weapon. The adrenaline of battle, the shadow of death, the primal, undeniable relief of survival. It all coalesced into a single, overwhelming force. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He didn't know her language, and words would have been useless anyway. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away the grime and blood from her cheek. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, a silent surrender, and then he kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision, a desperate, hungry confirmation of life in the face of death. It was the taste of ozone, blood, and sweat. It was the raw, unrestrained release of every unspoken feeling that had passed between them for weeks. She responded with equal ferocity, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer until there was no space left between them. In that moment, under the gaze of a bleeding purple moon, the forastero was no longer a captive, and the huntress was no longer his master. They were just a man and a woman, finding an anchor in the storm of a savage world. The universe seemed to hold its breath. The fires of the raid were dying down to smoldering embers, and the violet moon cast long, sorrowful shadows across the wounded village. In the aftermath of their desperate kiss, the raw adrenaline of battle gave way to a profound, aching tenderness. Rusty didn't release Kirishai, nor she him. They simply stood there, clinging to one another amidst the carnage, 2 survivors who had found a startling, savage clarity in the heart of violence. He gently pulled back, his gaze tracing the line of the gash on her side. Honor demanded the debt be paid. He led her back to her dwelling, the same place he had been brought as a captive. Now he entered as a partner, an equal. He found the same bowl and herbs she had used on him and, with a silent, questioning look, received her nod of consent. His hands, calloused and scarred from a life of hard labor and harder fights, were surprisingly gentle as he cleaned her wound. He worked with a focused intensity, his touch conveying a depth of care that words never could. She watched his face, her golden eyes tracing the strong line of his jaw, the weariness around his eyes, the scar on his brow. When he was done, dressing the wound with the same leaf bandages she had used on his leg, she reached up and gently touched the side of his face. It was a gesture of profound gratitude, of ownership, of acceptance. That night they didn't speak. There was no need. They shared her furs, and their coming together was not the wild, frenetic clash of after-battle passion, but something slower, deeper. It was an exploration of scars, both visible and hidden. It was the silent sharing of solitude, a temporary merging of 2 lonely souls who had only ever known how to stand on their own. For the first time in more years than he could count, Rusty Vance slept without the ghost of his broken promise whispering in his ear. He slept like a man who had finally come home. In the days that followed, a new reality settled. The Jarok-Tul were defeated, and Rusty was no longer a prisoner. He was a hero to the Cathar. He was the Vorna, the Sky Warrior. He walked the village freely and was met with nods of deep respect. He helped rebuild, his strength and knowledge a welcome boon. He hunted with the warriors, his marksmanship with his restored revolver earning him a legendary status. And every night he returned to Kirishay's side. It was a life he could never have imagined. A life of purpose, of belonging, a life where his strength was valued and his heart was seen. He watched Kirishay lead her people, her burden now shared, and he felt a rightness to it all, a sense of peace that was as foreign as it was seductive. But the stars have a way of calling to those who have lived among them for too long. One morning he found himself staring out past the canopy, at the sliver of black sky visible between the giant leaves. The Betsy was still out there, a loose end, a piece of his old life he had to tie off. With a silent understanding passing between them, Kirishay gave him a small pack of food and pointed him in the direction of the crash site. She knew he had to go. She trusted he would return. The walk back through the jungle was different. The world was no longer a trap. It was territory he knew, its sounds familiar, its dangers understood. He found the Betsy lying broken and silent, an ugly metal scar in the vibrant green. "Well, look what the sandcat dragged in." Betsy's voice crackled to life as he powered up the auxiliary systems. "I was about to file a missing persons report. Did you enjoy your little camping trip? Get it all out of your system?" "Quiet, Bets," he murmured, his hands already flying across the diagnostic panels. The damage was severe but not irreparable. The main conduits were fused, but a clever bypass could work. The cryoconverter was shattered, but he might be able to reroute power from the life support reserves for a single desperate jump. It would be a gamble, a gut-wrenching one-way ticket off this world. For 3 days he worked. He wrestled with charred plating, spliced wires with trembling hands, and cursed at the stubborn, broken heart of his only true home. The work was a meditation, a violent prayer, and with every repaired connection the pull of the void grew stronger. This was who he was, a mechanic, a pilot, a drifter, a man who fixed what was broken and then moved on. On the 3rd day, a deep, resonant hum vibrated through the ship's deck. The fusion core stabilized. Green lights flickered to life on the main console. The Betsy was alive. She was wounded, crippled, but she could fly. He returned to the village at dusk. Kirishay was waiting for him on the main platform, her silhouette framed against the twin moons. She knew. She could see it in his eyes. She didn't ask. She simply stated a truth. She placed a hand on his chest, over his heart. Then she swept her other hand out, indicating the village, the trees, her people. And finally, she placed her hand on her own heart. The offer was absolute, unspoken, and all-encompassing. Stay. This can be your life. I can be your life. You don't have to be alone anymore. It was the ultimate temptation. It was redemption. It was a port in the endless storm of his life. Everything a weary man could ever want. He could stay here, be her warrior king, and protect her people. He could build a future and let the past fade into memory. But honor is a cruel master. The debt he owed was not to the future, but to the past. The promesa quebrada wasn't just a memory. It was a brand on his soul. To accept her offer would be to hide from that debt, to pretend the ghost didn't exist. He couldn't be the protector she and her people deserved until he had faced the man he had been. He could not build a new home on the rotten foundation of his own failure. He slowly took her hand from his chest and held it in both of his. He looked into her molten gold eyes, letting her see the vast empty space inside him, the source of the sorrow she'd always sensed. He shook his head once, a movement so slight it was barely perceptible, but she understood. Her expression didn't change, but he saw the light in her eyes dim, a universe of acceptance and heartbreak in a single glance. She was a queen, and she would not beg. She was a huntress, and she knew when to let her prey go. She simply squeezed his hand, a final painful acknowledgement of what could never be. Their farewell was not one of words. It was the long, silent walk to the edge of the village. It was the pressure of her hand in his. It was the final, lingering look that spoke of shared battles, of stolen nights, and of a love that was too wild to be caged. He turned and walked away without looking back, because he knew if he did, he would never leave. The sound of his own footsteps on the jungle floor was the loneliest sound in the galaxy. Back in the cockpit of the Betsy, the familiar scent of oil and ozone filled his lungs. He strapped himself into the command chair, his home, his prison. The engines groaned in protest, but they held. With a shudder that shook the ship to its very core, the old freighter lifted off the ground, tearing itself free from the emerald embrace of Krillus Prime. As he broke through the atmosphere, He allowed himself one last look at the planet on his viewport. It was a perfect, swirling jewel of green and blue, a paradise he had found and lost. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that he was leaving the only woman who had ever truly dominated him, not with nets and spears, but with a strength that had forced him to look at his own. He flicked a switch on his console. The low, mournful notes of an old blues guitar filled the cockpit, a familiar lament for a lonely road. He pointed the Betsy's nose towards the endless, star-dusted dark and pushed the throttle forward. The journey continued. The ghost was still riding shotgun. True honor isn't found in a new life, but in facing the debts of the old one. The road is long and lonely, but it's better when we travel together. If this story touched you, subscribe and share it with a friend who appreciates the old code of honor.